Well, maybe you've noticed this, and that is how the titles that we have for parables tend to shape our interpretation, what we perceive in them, what we understand about them. A good example would be the parable of the Good Samaritan. It used to be almost everybody had heard of that one. Most of us still have. The parable of the Good Samaritan. You read that at the beginning of a biblical text, and you already know, before you read the story, who the hero is going to be, don't you? The Good Samaritan. Or how about this? We read on a page in Luke, the parable of the prodigal son. Aren't we clued in on who we're going to focus on when we read the text? And who we're going to pay closest attention to? You see, often the title tells us what to look for or what to listen for. And that brings us to today's parable. Because in the New Revised Standard Version, which is the translation that we use here in this place, this parable has a title. Right there on the page, it's called the Parable of the Talents. Now, before I go any further, let me say that what we hear when we hear the word talents is not what Matthew or his audience heard when they heard that word. We hear talents and we think of innate abilities that people bring to life or have been given to use in life. They heard talents and they heard described a large amount of money. A talent was more money than most people made in a whole year of labor. A huge amount. But already, if you start, whether you're talking about innate abilities or whether you're talking about a huge amount of money, you start with the title. And it tells you what to expect will be emphasized. And so much the better, actually, for preachers who this time of year or this month or this Sunday are preaching on stewardship. A lot are. It is that season in the church year. Other congregations are observing Dedication Sunday today. And they look at this parable through the lens that is suggested by that title. And that is the lens of resources. And when they do, the parable becomes an allegory. And in the allegory, the master equals God, and the talents equal our gifts and our resources that we've been given by God. And the faithful Christian response is represented by the actions of the first two slaves. And then the last servant is an example of how not to act, what not to do. And with this interpretation, the last servant is an illustration not only of how not to act, but of Christians who are so bound by fear that they just can't try anything new or bear to take risk. And they end up, in the process, useless, squandering their possibilities. Now, why do you think I can rattle off that interpretation so easily as that? It's because it's the way I've preached this text time and time again, every third year when it comes up in the lectionary. And looking back, I see how the way I preached the text was all about the way I was guided by the title that I found on the page. It shaped where I focused and the way I heard what was there. It's all about what we do with what we've been given and whether we're willing to invest in spite of risk in what God is up to in the world. And today, as noble as that might be, today I want to try a different interpretation based on a different title. I want to try giving this parable a different title and see where that takes us, or where that might take us or what it might encourage us to do with this text, and whether or not we can interpret it in ways that open it up to new possibilities and in the process open us up as well. And it's not just a lark either. Because one reason that Jesus taught in parables or spoke in parables was that parables can be a way of making space for different kinds of understandings and new interpretations. Parables can be a way of teaching that challenge people to think again about what they thought they knew. So why not use this parable as a way of thinking again about what we thought we knew? When the rabbis used parables, they meant them to provoke, to confuse, to disturb, to entice people into imagining themselves in their world in different ways rather than just the conventional ways. So I think it's worth doing that with this parable. And last but not least, in the Greek text, in the original text for this passage, there was no title. There was no parable of the talents. Jesus didn't say, now I'm going to tell you the parable of the talents. He just told a story. And the fact that there's a title there on the page means that long after Jesus told the story and long after Matthew put together this gospel, one of the students of this text listened to it, made a certain judgment about what it meant to him, and then said, this is what it should mean to you, and left a title on the page. So, given all of that, having said all of that, I want to suggest a new title. I want to suggest that we call this text the parable of the one who said no. And if we do that, where does your focus go? If we call this the parable of the one who said no, where does your focus go? Where is your attention drawn? Isn't it drawn to the last of the three servants? Isn't it drawn to the one who is labeled wicked and lazy? Or should I say the one called that by the master? And if that's the case, what kind of master goes around calling his servants wicked and lazy? And isn't it possible that the fact that this master does that suggests that maybe we're going to change the way we view this master as we change the title and our understanding of this text? So keep that in mind for now. And then let's just take a look at the master here, the one traditionally understood as representing God, and consider how accurate that might be. Because I think if we're at all honest, we have to say that in the rest of the gospel, the God who is proclaimed there in the rest of Matthew's gospel, in the other stories and the other parables that Matthew offers, is a God revealed as a liberator of God's people. One who sets them free, one who brings grace to their lives, one who loves creation, the whole of it, and one who is freely and again, frequently merciful. Is that what this master is like? Or to turn it around, does this master look like the God proclaimed in the rest of the gospel? Furthermore, the master here doesn't challenge it when the last servant describes him or depicts him as someone who is harsh and who takes what is not his. Doesn't challenge it. What does he do instead? After the third servant speaks up, the master decides to live into that description, doesn't he? more fully than before. So he snatches away the one talent. He throws that servant out. He abandons him to the space of shadows and great pain, where there is moaning and groaning and gnashing of teeth. Does that sound like the God we see in Jesus? Well, there's another reason right there. Another reason to challenge this. And there is still another, and that is the historical context. The world of that time into which this parable was spoken. You see, in the ancient days, the way wealthy landowners increased their wealth was to acquire more land. And the way they acquired more land was to offer agricultural loans with very high interest rates to small farmers around them. That is, farmers who owned less and land and who had fewer resources. And then when these smaller farmers couldn't pay back the loans, which happened quite a bit, quite frequently, then these major landowners would foreclose on the small farmers and take their land from them. And thus the large landowners became more and more wealthy, and the small landowners became not only poor, but also eventually landless. And in those days, to be landless, well, was, to say the least, dangerous. It left you vulnerable in the extreme. So we're talking about a way of life that benefited those at the top, while it exploited those underneath, in which those with great power took advantage of those with little power, in which those who could enforce their will exploited those who had no way to protest or complain or make their needs known. They had no voice that could be heard in the larger realm. It was a way of life that not only favored those at the top, but let loose a chain reaction. So that when those at the top loaned money to those underneath them, they became equally as ruthless in trying to get their money back lest they lose their land, and equally ruthless because you know what else happened? There was a payoff. If they brought back more money to their master, well, then he'd share the take with them. So this world was a world in which there was a sort of an endless cycle of this kind of wealthy people taking advantage of the less wealthy people. And that's the world in which Jesus told this parable. So the ones who heard it, Matthew's audience, they would have known exactly who he was talking about and what he was talking about, and they would have known all too well about immoral profit-making ventures undertaken by absentee landlords. And in this case, this is an absentee landlord who even goes so far as to suggest to the third servant that he should have invested his money with the bankers and made money through interest. That was against Jewish law. So again, is that the God we see in Jesus? Is that the God Matthew talks about in the rest of his gospel? Anyway, back to the parable. The parable of the one who said no. In this parable, what happens? The master does nothing but reflect the ways of the world around him. He doesn't challenge what is cruel and oppressive. He doesn't challenge the economic system which works that way. He doesn't lift a finger to help the victim of all of this. He doesn't speak out against what is so cruel and that's what Jesus did over and over and over again, one more reason to challenge any interpretation of this text which equates the Master with God. We need to get over that. And what we need to do then is ask this question: what if in this parable that Jesus told right before he entered Jerusalem for the last time, and right before he came face to face with those who would put him to death, what if he was actually following up in that context earlier teachings that he offered his disciples about the cost of discipleship? Maybe he was using this parable to illustrate the danger that comes when one speaks out against oppression and against exploitation and against cruel injustice. Maybe he's illustrating what happens when one chooses not to participate in a cycle of those with more getting more and those with less getting less, and the rich getting rich and the poor getting poorer. In other words, he's telling a story about what happens whenever one chooses to stand out and to speak out and to say no to anyone and anything that dehumanizes the ones who are beloved by God. And when he does, he tells us what happens. What did happen to that servant? What did he get in return for taking his stand against what he saw as unfair and not right and wrong? In response to his no, he was stripped of all he had, wasn't he? And thrown into the place he'd never known, abandoned to the place of shadows and pain, where there is wailing and moaning and gnashing of teeth. That's what happened to Jesus, wasn't it? And it suggests, I believe, that Jesus was using this parable as a way of deepening what he meant when he said, whoever would become my follower must deny themselves, must take up their cross, and then follow. To the one who said no, to the last servant. It's what happened, and it's an example of the risks we take when we follow Jesus. So the question to us, I guess, who can hear this parable in that way is, have you said no to something lately? Have you said no to participating in behavior or a system or a joke or a slur that you knew would be experienced by another as cruel or unfair or hurtful? Have you said no to doing something or making a decision you knew in your gut reflected more the way the world is rather than the way God means it to be? And when you did, was it costly? Did it feel risky? Did it leave you knowing yourself vulnerable? And I ask that, realizing that in this parable, all of that is so dramatic, a dramatic stand against a huge system, and the result is things beyond our imagination in some ways. And it can be that, but more often it's much more subtle. More often it's much less dramatic. More often it's just a matter of small everyday decisions that we make by which we say no to the power of greed, which tells us that those with more deserve to get more and those with less are just out of luck. More often it's just saying no in small and subtle ways to cynicism and apathy over the cruelty of the way things are and the cruelty that others endure. Dramatic or less dramatic, I think it's true that every day we who follow Jesus are called to say no in one way or another to the forces of polarization and division which can tear our communities apart. And no to voices not only out there, but voices in our head which tell us that we need to be scared of each other because of the stereotypes that we project onto each other. Every day we're called to look at this third servant in this parable and to say no to so much of the way the world is and the way the world functions, because unless we do that, we're never going to become the persons that God in Christ calls us to be. Earlier in this talk, I mentioned that Jesus told this tale, this parable, right before he headed to Jerusalem for the last time. Right before he himself would have to say no again and again and again to the temptation of violence, to the temptation, to the lure of self-protection, no to the danger of returning evil for evil, no to the power of empire and of fear. And his saying no resulted in him being tossed out, in everything being taken from him, in him being nailed to a cross, abandoned to the place of shadows and pain, where there is wailing and moaning and gnashing of teeth. And yet, at the very point at which Jesus' no looked to have been permanently snuffed out and silenced, that's when God's own no went to work. And when the world and our lives were dramatically changed forever. The parable of the one who said no. Maybe it's a title that just might stick. Amen. We continue our worship with our gifts and our offerings, and I will